really glad that you're here and excited that you got the opportunity to learn about the Enneagram. So how many of us come tonight with some sense of knowledge about Enneagram? Cool. Way to go. And the rest of you, I assume, are like, oh, what am I here for, right? So thanks for coming. I'm really excited to welcome Doug Scott. I just almost had I call it a brain fart, Doug, but we won't talk about those things. Doug is a great guy. He's a therapist here in town. He studied the Enneagram under Richard Rohr, who's one of the pioneers in this in modern day age. And he does some great work with this, and you're going to learn a lot. So we're very excited that he's here, and he'll give you lots of great information and insight tonight as you gather. Will you join me in prayer as we prepare our time together? Holy and gracious God, thank you for this day. It's been a glorious one. So we're grateful for all that already has been, and we're certainly excited about what lies ahead. Pray that this night might be full of both energy and excitement about the Enneagram and the ways in which it can help captivate us for greater purpose in the world and in relationship with others. So thanks for the information, thanks for the insights, and pray your blessing upon all who gather tonight. May it be an exciting endeavor and an opportunity for growth. For all of that, we give you thanks. In Christ's name, amen.
Okay, I guess I'm on. Good. Hello, everybody. I wanted to say beforehand that on the table back there, in addition to the Enneagram by the book by Susan Stabile, I have brought a few of my books that have been important for me in the development of this talk, really the development of my spirituality, but also how I've applied it psychologically. And so if you're interested in diving into some of the material, they're not available for purchase because they're the only books I've got, but you can take a look at them and maybe get a copy of them yourself. I also have, I put some cards of mine in the back, counseling cards. And the way I understand myself as a counselor or coach is it's the client's car. They're in the driver's seat. I'm in the passenger seat. They get to decide where they're going, and I help them navigate how to get there. And I use the Enneagram. In fact, what we're going to be talking about today, we have the luxury of talking about, kind of expanding a little bit. But what you're getting today is often what I give my clients, kind of broken up in different sessions. So this is distilled teaching that I have put together over, I've been teaching the Enneagram since 2007. So it's a long time. And I've been studying the true self, false self dynamic since 2003. Is anybody familiar with the sense of the true self and false self? One person. Okay. Two. Okay. You must be a 9 since you didn't want to raise your hand. I'm just kidding. Quite honestly, I don't know how to teach the Enneagram without first delving into what I actually consider more important than the Enneagram. So this is a total sham what I'm doing because we told you to come in for the Enneagram. But we're going to be talking about the true self, false self, what those feel like, and then we're going to apply the Enneagram on top of that. Because if we don't get the true self, false self correct, then what ends up happening, which I've done, you're going to do a little bit if this is your first time in the Enneagram, is it becomes a little bit of a game. Oh, he's a 3, he's a 2, she's a perfect 10. But you have to kind of go through the process of that initial trying to apply it to oneself and to somebody else. But a lot of people actually stop at that superficial level. And the Enneagram is not descriptive. You're going to get that. The Enneagram is not something that's going to give you some personality insight, although you're going to get that too. Those are secondary, believe it or not. What the real Enneagram's power is, and it's what has been for centuries, believe it or not, in different forms, is that it's been a tool for transformation, And so that's why I'm excited to teach the Enneagram, but it's only a tool insofar as we can understand it, what our true self feels like versus when we are in the energy of our false self. So what I'm giving you today for both people here and hello people online, I'm glad you could join us as well. What I'm going to be giving you today is this synthesis of the true self, false self, and the Enneagram. And it's going to be done largely using symbols. Because if you're like me, it's so helpful to have imagery, symbols that I can remember. And once you get the symbol right, everything kind of falls logically into place. So that's what we're going to be talking about today, okay? We are going to be covering lots of stuff. This might be new for a lot of you, even the true self, false self talk. If you have a question, feel free to raise your hand. And then if we have a whole lot of questions, I may end up putting a pause on that and then coming back towards the middle or towards the end. So if we don't get to you, then we will at some point, okay? I'm also planning on staying after the whole thing for a little bit of time if you wanted to ask more specific questions. So my wife gave me permission, the boss. She's a 9, so she's laid back, but I'm a 2 and I want to please, so I have to ask her. Okay, so this is called the Unshallow Enneagram, living towards wholeness. Living towards wholeness. Because the reason why I chose wholeness is that a lot of scripture scholars these days are actually unearthing a lot of the theological language that we're so used to. And the word holiness often has, like in our Western mind, a purity attachment to it. The more pure you are, the holier you are. And that's actually not, from what I understand, that is not specifically what the biblical understanding of holiness was or is. Holiness actually comes from the sense of integration, inner integrity, where all the pieces of your inner life, the shadow sides, which we're going to be looking at today in the Enneagram, and the sides that we're aware of, the conscious level, are integrated in a energy of love, acceptance, forgiveness, generosity. See, those are all integration things. And so in English, we actually have an advantage because the word holiness actually comes from wholeness. You see? So from now on, when you read the Bible and it says holiness, think of it as wholeness. And this idea that God is reality itself of a holistic nature, the great hologram of which we are all individual holons, microscopic aspects of this incredibly large reality. Okay, so wholeness. And you can already see, I'm going to be talking about some pretty deep subjects. I'm hoping to offer you interesting little tweaks on some common words that we use, like wholeness, for example. Okay. Let's see if there's anything else I wanted to say. A little bit about a background. I grew up in Keller, Texas, and then I went to UNT, University of North Texas, with graduated in psychology and Spanish. And then I went to Nicaragua for 2 years. My faith background, when I started out, is Catholic. And so I went with the Franciscans. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, but I went with the Nicaragua, with the Franciscans for 2 years and lived amongst the Nicaraguans there on the Atlantic coast. And then came back and got 2 master's degrees at Boston College. One is clinical social work, which allows me to be licensed and do counseling. And then the other one is pastoral ministry. And my specific focus in pastoral ministry was psychology. So I'm approaching this from a psychological standpoint, a spiritual standpoint, transformative, because I don't see any difference between good psychology and good spirituality. For me, it's two sides of the same coin. So that what you're getting from me tonight is 21 years of synthesizing work. And so I'm excited to present it to you. What does this shape bring up for you? When you look at this shape, I know this is very gestalt, but when you look at this shape, what does, there's no wrong answers except you might go to hell. I'm just kidding. What does this shape look like? What does it remind you? Does it evoke anything? Yes, ma'am. Balance. Good. Balance. Yep. Disco ball. Did you grow up in the 70s? You were there. You remember. Okay. Yeah, disco ball. Somebody from the front. I mean, you guys sat up here on purpose. You right there, you're looking, please don't call on me. I'm just kidding. You don't have to. Somebody else, one more person.
Looks like the top sphere is under some turbulence.
Good. So the top sphere there's some turbulence in the top sphere. Good. Okay. All right. So this actually right here, if you can remember what this looks like and this shape, you'll remember all of the true self, false self, which I actually call the anchored self and floating self. Okay. That's the whole talk is in these shapes right here. So the very bottom, the very, very bottom, we have the ground of being, God, the creator. And sometimes when I present this, I may not be with people who are necessarily spiritual at all. Maybe they're atheists. And that's okay, because this still works. You know, if the gospel is the gospel, then it needs to be able to be spoken in all different kinds of ways. And what I'm giving you tonight actually is from my perspective, it's totally the gospel. It's presented in a psychological and different spiritual way, but from my understanding, this is absolutely the gospel, especially in a way of learning how to listen to our sufferings and learning how to receive love. So this is the gospel. So for some people, we can call this bottom part the collective. Okay, but regardless, it's something that transcends us, but includes us. Bigger than us, but including us. The anchored self is who you really and truly are, below all your levels of identity, below your job, below your titles, and it is the self that we could say even is maybe correlative with the soul. Or it's where the indwelling Christ is inside you. These are all words of trying to get to a reality, and of course words do a poor job. But your anchored self is your true self. And it's important to try to understand the difference between your true self, your anchored self, and your floating self. So I'm going to put all the rest of the labels there, and then we're going to kind of drop in and see about those differences. Your floating self is your false self. It's the identity self. It's the self that you think you are or that other people project on you. Okay? It's the self that you want people to be able to see. This is who I am. See? It can be the mask. Now, the reason why I have changed it from the false self to the floating self, in part because the dynamic works on actually learning how to get into your anchored self or your true self. There is a falling downward. So it makes sense to kind of make this model look like it is. But the other reason why I changed false to floating is that false can have a negative connotation. It's not false, then I don't want it, kind of thing. But that wasn't the point. Even in the teaching, and several psychologists and spiritual masters, including Thomas Merton. I'm not sure if you know who that is, but Thomas Merton was the first one in English to kind of move into this true self, false self piece. But the floating self is not the bad self. It's just not the anchored self. It's just not the true self. The floating self is not bad, but it is dangerous if that is the only self we think we are. And what I mean by that is, think about somebody in your own life, or it could ourselves included, is have you ever known anybody who seems to be so wrapped up in their image or their occupation or who they think they are, and you kind of hang around them long enough, and you wonder if they have even scratched the surface of life. They could be even elderly people, successful, but you wonder, how did this superficiality just stay there? Okay, floating self, people. And on the other hand, have you ever known somebody who, when you're in their presence, and maybe they don't even have to say very much, but when you're in their presence, you feel received, accepted, loved. There's an expansion. There's like an expanse, a spaciousness in their presence where you know that you don't have to play the games that we normally play. And even if you were to tell them some of the things that you're thinking or what you're doing, they're really more important about how are you. They meet you where you are at. They see the real you deep down inside. And this is real important if you're working for kids, with kids. Because kids, they're still learning their identities. The floating self is important. They have to have an identity. And that's all they really know. But when kids are really attracted to spending time with mentors, it's because they know that the mentor's anchored self is calling forth and connecting with the anchored self in that kid, even if that kid doesn't know that they have an anchored self. Because there is a biblical notion of deep calls unto deep. The deep in me connects with the deep in you. And if you're one of my clients and you're Christian, then I will always say, usually at the beginning session or the second session, is I've only had one client in 20 years of being a counselor. Only one. And that one client is the broken and risen Christ. That's your anchored self. And it's the broken and risen Christ in me that connects with the broken, risen Christ in you. You see the unity here? That's why people ask me, it's like, how can you just talk all day long and, receive all, get all this bad news from people, and doesn't it bother you? And for me, maybe I'm in denial. But it doesn't. It doesn't at all, because for me, it's simply Christ coming in the guise disguised as you, and then you leave, and then somebody else comes in, and it's still the same person, Christ in them. And my job, to be really, really honest with you as a counselor, is simply to help people connect with their anchored self. Once I've done that, then that's it. Then it's just maintenance work. How can you live from your anchored self? And I use the Enneagram to do it. But you got to be able to understand that there is such a thing as an anchored self and a floating self. Your anchored self is patient. It's kind. See, you can tell a Catholic when they're like, God, it's in the Bible somewhere. And I don't know, maybe Methodists are the same way. Love is patient. Love is kind. I mean, when you are listening to Paul's beautiful poetry there, he's talking about the anchored self, you see. And actually, as we're going along here in the next few minutes, what you're going to find is that when you can understand the anchored self, floating self better, you actually can understand Paul a lot better. And we're going to get a sense of that in a second. Okay? Now, the winds, I'm sorry, I should say, the thing that connects the floating self with the anchored self, I just simply have termed it the holy tether. The holy tether. Because it is what tethers together your identity, your sense of self, with the depth of who you are. Okay? You know, another way to look at the anchored self and floating self is to look at the difference between deep time and psychological time. Deep time is the time that your anchored self is always in. It's the self, for example, that when you are in the presence of someone who's dying, or in the presence of someone who's giving birth, or in the presence when you have the awareness of presence in a conversation that is so rooted that you come out of that thinking, I am different after than before. Like there was some shift that just happened. I was well met, and I met that person well. Okay. That's called deep time because you kind of lose track of time. See, God is the eternally present one. God is eternally present, the eternal now. It's all happening now in the life of God. And your anchored self knows that. And when you are caught up into something that you are enjoy, that is just joyful, and it's just uniquely you, and you lose track of time, in that moment you were in your anchored self. And you could be on I-35 and someone could cut you off and you aren't even at all angry. You might bless them. You see? 2 fingers instead of 1. Except Alyssa, who's an 8, and she's always doing the 1, but just kidding. So this is the anchored self. Then the floating self is constantly offended, a constant need to prove themselves, a constant need to be right. Do you know anybody who always has to be right? Who doesn't even know how to say, I'm sorry? Oh, they'll say, well, I do say I'm sorry. I'm sorry, but what happens with the but? It just takes away, erases the I'm sorry. So, someone who always has to win, someone who always has to be right, someone who has to manipulate and dominate and cannot understand the energy of vulnerability, no matter how successful they are, is somebody who hasn't discovered their anchored self yet. And at some point when you're in your anchored self, you don't really get so mad. Now you are able to set boundaries. The anchored self knows how to be assertive, but it won't be coming from a place where I got to beat you at the game. It won't be coming a place where I've got to win for the sake of winning because I'm tired of you winning. It'll be coming from a place of, I kind of feel sorry for you because you must not be very happy. You see, the floating self is eternally fragile. It's not a stable self. The anchored self is rooted in God, in the ground of being, so it's incredibly stable. Okay? But the floating self, it gets whipped around by the winds of emotion. Winds of emotion. Today I'm happy, tomorrow I'm sad. Today I'm happy, tomorrow I'm sad. Whatever the emotion is. But the anchored self, on the other hand, is centered and actually is experienced as joy. Because you can be sad and joyful. But you can't be sad and happy at the same time. But you can be sad and joyful. You can even be angry and joyful. Why? Because the joy is coming from a rootedness that really is beyond words, but you just know that you're held. Okay. All right. Here's a couple of scripture quotes. Live by the Spirit, I say, and do not gratify the desires of the flesh. For what the flesh desires is opposed to the Spirit, and what the Spirit desires is opposed to the flesh. For these are opposed to each other to prevent you from doing what you want. What if you were to translate the word flesh for floating self and spirit for anchored self? You see, our culture has misinterpreted the flesh word for the body. And then we've gotten all kinds of trouble over 2,000 years of this kind of interpretation. Instead, what scripture scholars are now saying is Paul is actually trying to say something more similar to what we now have the vocabulary for, which is this deeper self, which he's calling spirit. And that flesh would be more of your floating self, the false self. Because if I am too ensconced in my floating self, I will not do what I want to do. And you just be around people and saying counseling, and they're saying constantly like, God, I know I want to do this, but I just don't know how. And so that's a discovery of the anchored self. Then they tell me how they're going to do it. They'll discover their own anchored self, and their anchored self tells them what to do. Christ, there's a direct link there. Okay. Another one is, if you sow to your own floating self, you will reap corruption from the floating self. But if you sow to the anchored self, you will reap eternal life from the anchored self. The anchored self, like your soul, the indwelling Christ, that's the self that God sees, that God communicates with. God understands the floating self, just like you would understand if you had a 5-year-old or a 3-year-old, screaming and yelling and jumping around, and I hate you. But if you're that child's parents after timeout, you wouldn't be offended for a 3-year-old acting like a 3-year-old, because you know that 3-year-old is much deeper than they themselves realize. So you accept the floating self, but you really love the anchored self. See? Those who live according to the floating self set their minds on the things of the floating self. But those who live according to the anchored self set their minds on the things of the anchored self. Or wholeness. You see? There's different ways to interpret. I'm not saying it's the only way, not the right. I'm not saying it's the best way. It's a different angle. So try it on. Another Christian quote, deep calls unto deep. We've talked about that. Your anchored self, when you're vibrating in the energetics of your anchored self, that is picked up. And you will instantly, like sympathetic resonance. If you have 2 guitars in the same room and you pluck an E chord, that E chord travels across and begins to vibrate the E chord over here. Sympathetic resonance. Well, that's what happens when you are in your anchored self. You're connecting with the anchored self of somebody else. I assure you that unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it can only be a single seed. But if it does die, it bears much fruit. See? If we stay in our floating self, we're not going to bear a lot of fruit. We may be successful, but we're not going to be remembered. But when you are in your anchored self, that is how God can use you and me as true instruments of Christ. Because just like Paul says, no longer I, but Christ who lives within me, you can translate as no longer my floating self, but my anchored self that's within me is now being embodied by me. That's the Christ in me now sort of come alive and changing the world one person at a time. See, that's the anchored self living. Okay? Here's a Buddhist quote. And so the right dharma here is that we have a true self and a false self. We have a permanent self and an impermanent self. Here, wrapped in the delusion of daily life, we experience existence from the vantage point of the false self most of the time. Now, that does tend to be true until you know what your anchored self feels like. Now, the positive thing is that your life can be a lot more fruitful and joyful. But the con, so the pros and cons, the con of learning how to be in your anchored self is that you're sort of ruined because you'll never be satisfied with the games of the floating self anymore. Even just what satisfied me yesterday, once you get a sense of the anchored self, it's not going to be satisfying anymore. Okay, Richard Rohr talks about the paradox of falling upwards. And that's why I created this diagram to show that there is a falling down. The anchored self, if you can handle the little metaphor here, is pulling, or you could even say God through the anchored self is pulling on the holy tether, pulling down the floating self. And what are the mechanisms of this downward falling? It is great love and great suffering. Because those are the only things strong enough in our life to break open the floating self, to reveal the games that we've been playing for most of our life. Great love is not necessarily romantic love. I've seen it work, but only if the romantic love creates a vulnerability. But just falling in love isn't the love I'm talking about. It's the vulnerability that comes from loving well. But also a mentor can do the great love. You ever been around somebody who just loves you so much, even though maybe you don't deserve it, or somebody who's forgiven you? You know, even though, wow, I don't know why they have forgiven me. And the only thing you can do in those moments, because of the vulnerability you feel, is to try to match that energy with them, with yourself. You're kind of changed. And you go out and you try to give that off, that depth. That's pulling down on the floating self. But then great suffering is also the other thing that is big enough to break us open, where we are powerless to affect change. The way I define suffering is when I am powerless and I want to control something. When I want to control something, but I am completely powerless to do it. That's a moment of suffering. Now, it can be like I'm suffering because of the stoplight is too long, or I'm suffering because there's a divorce going on or a death. You know, it could be the spectrum. But the suffering itself can also, for listening to our suffering well, can be that tug down the floating self balloon down into the anchored self. Okay? And the purpose of life, to be honest, I think you got ready to listen to the purpose of life. The purpose of life is actually to learn to live from your anchored self most of the time. See, the purpose of life looks like a snowman. I'm just kidding. But do you see where you have God, or the transcendent self underneath? You have the anchored self here, and then on top you have the floating self right on top. And so what happens is that you intentionally use your identities. You use your occupation. You use your wealth. You use your power. These things aren't bad. But you don't use it for your own sense of well-being. You use it from your anchored self perspective. And then all of a sudden, you're finding that you're simply serving Christ in everyone you meet. Because you're also going to think, I've only met one person. It's that inner Christ. It's the anchored self in the other person. And whomever you meet then, the more anchored self you are, you're connecting with their anchored self. And you're going to use your gifts and talents and identities and whatever it is to empower somebody else from their anchored self level. So the purpose of life is to really learn to live into your anchored self and use your floating self to do good in the world. To be love and light, to be Christ to other people. Okay? One of the things that Richard Rohr is famous for saying, and I'll read this out loud, is the human ego prefers anything, just about anything, to falling or changing or dying. The ego is that part of you that loves the status quo, even when it's not working. It attaches to the past and present and fears the future. Okay? The anchored self is going to be centered even when you're anxious. It's okay to have anxiety, as long as you disidentify your true self from the anxiety. In other words, can you feel the difference in English if I say, I am anxious, versus I have anxiety? Do you feel the difference? The first one is I am. I'm identifying with that. I am anxious. But that's actually not a true statement. I mean, metaphysically, right? It works in English. But I have anxiety is correct because I am something deeper than my emotions. See? Okay. All great spirituality is what we do with our pain. If we do not transform our pain, we will transmit it to those around us. And if there's one thing you remember about this particular part A or part 1 of our talk tonight, of the anchored self, floating self, if you remember what I'm about to say, that will be enough. And that is, in my opinion, the real definition of a Christian is not somebody who can spout, eloquently scripture quotes and goes to church every Sunday and sort of checks the Christian church box. It's okay if we do those things. But the power of the Christian message, and I would argue good spirituality in any direction, is can you be an instrument of transformation of negativity? Can you and I enter into a situation or a space where there is negative energy, and most of us are able to kind of pick that up? Can you do that and at the very least neutralize it, but maybe even transform it? And the way you do that, in one way, and we're going to talk about this when we get to the Enneagram, but it's actually not to match negative energy with negative energy. What did Einstein say? The problem, no level of consciousness can solve a problem that created it. So if we create a huge problem and it's negative, we can't expect a negative energy solution to actually resolve that problem. There's got to be a new way. And your anchored self knows that. Your floating self is going to transmit it. And you might win that debate. You might win that fight. But the problem is not solved. The relationship is not repaired. But the anchored self knows what to do. Christ in you knows what to do, you see. And the Enneagram is one tool on learning how to do that. Okay, so looking at the cross in a new way, bridging crucifixion and resurrection. You don't get to the resurrection of your life without first going through the crucifixion. You see, one way to look at the cross in this whole idea of our Christian mysteries of the dying and rising of Christ is not to just see it in Christ and then amen, and then, thank Jesus for 2,000 years and then every year again, on Easter. That doesn't necessarily lead to transformation. It might mirror the theology we're given, but it doesn't necessarily lead to transformation. One way to look at a very powerful way to understand this mystery is that what Christ went through is also in us all the time. That when you have been powerless to affect change in your life for some reason, in that moment you are crucified upon the moment of powerlessness. And you can't do anything about it. But most of us don't know what to do with our pain. We'd rather just be angry and resentful or sad. But if we can hold on to the actual moment of the crucifixion long enough, then what ends up happening is that we live into the resurrection. And the resurrection is always going to be a new transformation. So an easy way to understand this from your own life is, I'm sure every single one of you can say that in your life there have been many opportunities where you never would have chosen to go through whatever you went through that would really sucked. And you wouldn't choose it now if given the opportunity. But at the same time, you could say it was one of the greatest things that ever happened to you. Isn't that a paradox? But you never would have gotten the wisdom and insight and love and all of that stuff had you not gone through it. You see, so that's a resurrection. But it first came from a crucifixion. And so another way to understand the anchored self, floating self stuff, another way to understand the Enneagram, and that's why I'm spending so much time setting up this foundation, is to learn and to really accept that it does require dying, but not dying for the sake of suffering. It's dying for the sake of knowing, vis-a-vis our faith, that resurrection is always there on the other side. If we can hang, if you will, in parentheses, hang on the cross long enough, and not alone, in solidarity with others. Okay? That's a Christian message. That's about as orthodox as you get. Just said it in a different way than maybe you're used to. Okay. All right. So again, the archetype of the wounded, resurrected Christ. So we have crucifixion plus resurrection is the archetypal message. Jesus came back with wounds. You ever thought about that? That means something. Jesus came back with wounds on his body. And so one of the things we can understand is that perfection or holiness or all of that stuff is not the absence of imperfection. It's not the perfect reality. It's a wounded reality. And that's what the message of the resurrection is supposed to teach us. The wounded body is that Jesus is the icon of reality itself. And even at the perfected level, the resurrected level, there's wounds. So you don't get to transformation, you don't get to resurrection, you don't get to depth in your life, in my life, without suffering or loving deeply. And it's not like that stuff goes away. So whenever I work with people who have anxiety, one of the things I tell them is, I kind of have different weird news for you. I'm not here to take away the anxiety. It'll probably always be a part of you. And in fact, it's actually going through the anxiety or the depression or whatever it is that you end up disidentifying with it and then managing it. So then for the rest of your life, you could have moments of anxiety or depression, whatever, but now it's not the master of you. You are going to have coping skills to deal with it. Your wounds will simultaneously be your teachers. When anxiety, for example, raises its head, you don't say, oh my God, not again. It's, what can you teach me today? You feel the difference? It's a radical switch. It's an acceptance, not an avoidance. Because transformation is about still being wounded. Okay. All right. So when you are deeply in your anchored self, you're going to call forth the anchored self from other people. And this is kind of a diagram to show that energy. The other thing I teach is the difference between the conscious, the subconscious, and the unconscious. It's also important because the conscience level is going to be the Enneagram, the surface level of the Enneagram. It's our floating self usually. It's kind of our, the thing, the reason, the actions we do. But the actions or even feelings we have are coming from the depth of our unconscious. And so what a subconscious is kind of like, something's going on, but you can't articulate it yet. It's just below the surface. That's called subconscious. So you have the unconscious, which is really dark. So if you were standing upon the iceberg looking down into the water, you'd be able to see the iceberg underneath the water for a little ways, and then it goes into black. The black part would be the unconscious. The blue part underneath the water would be the subconscious, and then you're on top of the conscience. And what good therapy is, what good conversations are, what it means to be in the presence of an anchored self person is where the water level goes down. Can you see that? Can you just imagine that the water level moves down to the level of the unconscious? You can start seeing all this stuff. And what the Enneagram does is it actually shines a spotlight. This is why it's the tool of transformation. It shines a spotlight in the areas that we may not see, but we nonetheless live out all the time. And have you ever been in a situation between you and somebody else where, God, we cannot get past this one issue? We keep having the same argument over and over again, or maybe you've seen it with two other people, where you just can't get past this. That's because, from using this diagram, you have two floating selves talking to each other, two people who are not acknowledging where the real problem is, and that is in the unconscious area. And when you get to that, then you are free not to act out in the compulsions that we normally do. See, that's what good spirituality, good psychology does. That's what I'm trying to present tonight. Okay. And then the other thing we're going to talk about, and we're about to jump into the Enneagram, is this idea of the old room and the new room. You see, remember when we talked about the ball dropping, the floating self dropping into the anchored self? Great love and great suffering thrusts us from the old room. So just take for an example, somebody who has a substance abuse problem or an alcohol, or somebody who maybe just had somebody break up with them. But let's just take the alcohol issue here, because I know that affects a lot of people. And let's say you have where somebody who wants to quit drinking, and so they quit drinking, and they leave the old room, and they're in liminal space. Liminal space is that place where all of you know, it's that place of suffering. It's that place where things don't make sense anymore. I don't know where I'm going anymore. I have no idea how to get there. I don't know what God wants of me. I don't even know if I'm believing in God anymore in the same way I used to. But the liminal space is simultaneously a place of deep growth, but it's uncomfortable. So most of us, most of the time, myself included, will turn right around and go into the old room again and redecorate it. And say kind of like, why did I ever leave this place? This is great. That drink after you've been sober for a couple of weeks or whatever. It's like, oh my God, yeah, I can be moderate now, this is the greatest whiskey I've ever had, or something like that, where you'll have people who are in relationships that are actually clearly abusive. They need to get out. They've tried to get out. And then after, let's say, 1 week of being able to just white knuckle it, the pangs, P-A-N-G-S, the pangs of loneliness bring us back into the old room. This time it's different. There's a honeymoon phase. It's wonderful. And then if you've been in the situation, you know that then tension builds. Pretty soon the old room doesn't satisfy. It's too small and you got to get out. Now, if you're able to handle the uncomfortability of the liminal space long enough, it actually opens into the new room. But you can't force the new room, or it wouldn't be liminal space. You can't tell God what God needs to do. And you can't tell God when God needs to do it. You just have to suffer or just be open to the love, ask the questions, live into the answers kind of thing. But you can only do that from the place of liminal space. And anchored self people learn to make their home right there. Why? Because once you've traversed into the new room, what happens then? It becomes a new old room at some point if you're growing. And then at some point, you're going to want to traverse that. So what you end up learning is that you're a pilgrim people, like Moses, always walking in the desert. And you're like Jesus, the Son of Man has no place to lay his head. See? So if we're called to be Christians and imitate Jesus, then it's really called liminal space living. It's another way to say Christian. And from the liminal space, you're going to be humble. You're going to be in your anchored self, and you're going to be able to meet other people and invite them into liminal space too. The Enneagram is a 9. Ennea means 9 in Greek. Gram is like line, shape. And 9 is, it does come from a 3. So you can think of it really, if you really just want to be the basic level, and that's fine, you can just think of it as a 3. Because there's a head center, we're going to talk about this, a body center, and a feeling center, or the heart. There's 3 distinct centers, and all of you will spend almost all of your life leading with one of the centers. You're going to have all 3, but you're going to be primarily a person who leads with their feelings, or with their ideas, or with their instincts, their body. And then you're going to use the other 2s kind of in the back burners. Okay? But from the 3 main ones, you have 3 of each. So that's where we get 9. Okay? So we've got the 9 is the peacemaker. We're going to go through all of this, so don't worry. And also, I'm going to ask you to keep me on track in terms of time, please. So we have the peacemaker. The 1 is the reformer. We've got the helper, number 2. Type 2. Type 3 is the achiever. Type 4 is the individualist. Type 5 is the investigator. Think of Sherlock Holmes. Type 6 is the loyalist. Type 7 is the enthusiast. And type 8 is the challenger. And there are other names, and so we're going to talk about some of the other names. And what I would invite all of you to do is, you're going to first hear this from the level of description, and that's, your brain's got to process this. It's good. But I really hope you are able to hear it from the level of energy. Because each type has a specific type of energy. The way I think of it is putting on a cloak, a type 2 cloak or a type 8 cloak. Just to give you an example while I'm talking about that, I am a type 2. I'm a type 2, a helper. No surprise, I'm a counselor. Just let me help you, people. And I don't like conflict. Type 2s really don't like it because we don't want to hurt other people's feelings. We often don't know what the heck we feel anyways. So we know everybody else's feelings. We just don't know what we feel. But anyways, what I have to do when I am needing to be assertive with, let's say, somebody I hired to do something and they didn't do it, or if I have to set some really strong boundaries with somebody because it's necessary, I will, because I know the Enneagram, I will do a little ritual that I do. And I actually like envision myself putting on the cloak of the 8. I channel my inner Alyssa. I'm just kidding. I put on the cloak of an 8, and I sort of feel into the ability to set boundaries and not care. You know? And then and I don't do it from an aggressive place, you know, I do it from an assertive place that sets boundaries, but I need to be able to draw boundaries, and that's real important. And then when I'm done, I take off the cloak, because that's not my normal place of my space. So be thinking about that. Also be thinking about people you know, because you'll see a certain energetic that they have that, oh, that kind of describes them. But mostly think about yourself. Okay. So I said there's the instinctive center, that's the 8, 9s, and 1s. These are the people who have immediate gut reactions to reality. They handle them very differently. But they have immediate gut reactions, and they have first impressions, and they're super stubborn on letting them go. I'm going to be making fun of you tonight. I'll be making fun of myself, so don't worry. The Enneagram is not a happy tool, and it's not a sad tool, but it's a transformative tool. So you have to kind of be able to be willing to go into the shadow, the unconscious, to be able to see the floating selves games. You see why I taught all that stuff first, because now you can get a sense of the trajectory of transformation. The feeling center, people like myself, the 2s, 3s, and 4s, we encounter life first and foremost vis-a-vis our feelings, heart, but they are not our feelings. We are, you know, sort of like empaths, or we're reading the energies of everybody else. We're feeling the feelings of everybody else, or we're making assumptions of how everybody else is feeling because that's how we would feel if we were in your shoes. And we're kind of mind readers. That's our gift. It's our shadow too. Everybody has a gift and a shadow. But we really are good at getting a sense of what other people would feel. But if you ask us, what do we feel? That's hard to do. Okay, so we'll talk about that. The thinking center are people who they gauge life first with their heads. So there's a sense where they're one step removed from their feelings, they're one step removed from immediate gut reactions. They operate from the level of ideas and an outline in their head. And how does this fit in? And they're actually fear-based people. The 5, 6, and 7s, they tend to be the most anxious types, and so they try to assuage their anxiety in different ways, and it's usually trying to make some form, making sense of the world through thoughts and ideas. So they're very attracted usually to things like the Enneagram, or philosophies or theologies, or so on and so forth. So we're going to kind of get to how that, because there's a 5 flavor, there's a 6 flavor, there's a 7 flavor, there's 3 flavors to each one of these major centers. Okay. So there are 9 life strategies on how to deal with life. This is important. We have all 9 types in you and me. You have all 9, all of them. So don't think you don't have all of them. You just have one of them that you've made an art form of. And nature and nurture and free will has codified the instant reactions by age 4. So you are a type usually around by age 4 because it's worked for you and it's how you've survived. So it's nature, genes, nurture, environment, and we choose it at some level. So think of it in terms of whatever hand you are. Like I'm right-handed. If a pencil falls, I don't think about picking it up with my left hand. I pick up everything with my right hand. If I'm going to write, it's with my right hand. It's my go-to. I don't have to think about it. That is your Enneagram type. Okay? The goal is to express the average to healthy version. So if you remember my little floating self, anchored self, right? The average to healthy is going to be just draw a line in the middle of the holy tether to your anchored self. So whenever I'm talking about this with my clients, I'm like, we want to be average to healthy versus average to unhealthy. Average to healthy. That's the spectrum we want to get on. All right. The goal is actually to get you out of a box. It's going to feel like I'm going to be putting you into the type box. But remember our conscious, subconscious, unconscious? The more that we understand what's below the water, then the freer we are to not live out those compulsions. That's not putting you in a box. That's getting you out of a box you didn't even know you were in. You and I. You see? And here's the cool thing. When you're in your anchored self, transformed people transform people. Hurt people hurt people. Floating self people hurt floating self people. Anchored self people help anchored self people. So the thing is that when you are in your anchored self, you are going to be able to help someone into their anchored self. And when you know the Enneagram, and I hope that tonight is just simply a little first course in your study, then you get to know the energies a little bit. You'll be able to match people, and you'll be able to speak to them in a way that they'll understand. I would never talk to a 2 the way I talk to an 8 in counseling. Because if I talk to a 2, we're too thin-skinned. But if I talk to an 8 like I do a 2, they would think I'm full of BS. So when I talk to an 8, I have to cuss a lot. And I situate my body, it's like all about power and crick on the neck. But when I match, and if they do because they're masters of BS, right? So if they say something that's just, oh God, that was so narcissistic, they do not get turned off by that. They tell me, thank you. You're the first person that's actually called me out on my crap. They respect me more because that's how they think. They're constantly looking out for their BS and other people, and they're sizing people up for their power and how they're abusing their power, because that's often, from the average to unhealthy, is what they do. And all of us, whatever type we do, we are always going to project our shadow, the things we don't like about ourselves, we're projecting that on somebody else. And we're blaming them for it. We're attacking them for it. So what Richard Rohr teaches is that whenever you are taking offense, whenever I am taking offense at somebody, I'm always in that moment in my floating self. And there's something about that person that is inside me and I can't see it. See? So an anchored self person, before they jump into anger, they're going to be able to sit with on the crucifix of what do I do with these emotions, and just sit there and ascertain what part do I need to own in myself, or what AA talks about. I got to keep my side of the street clean, because then you can set boundaries and be assertive appropriately. Otherwise, Hurt people hurt people. We're not transforming negativity, we're transmitting it. The goal is to help you empathize with others and help them embody their anchored selves. So here's how I'm going to present the Enneagram. Okay, so I'm putting it all together. We have the floating self, which is the compulsive self. That's up there. Then we have the holy tether, and then we have the anchored self. And one of the things I want to say to you is the healthier you become in your version of the healthy type that you are, you will have access to the healthy types of all the other types inside you. Because remember, it's inside you already. So, people ask me, well, I'm thinking about dating this person, but this person is a type 3 and I'm a type 6. Is that going to make a good match? They'll ask me these kinds of questions, which I understand. But the problem with that is all types can be disastrous if they're their floating selves. And all types can be absolutely amazing when they're in their anchored selves. Doesn't matter which type you are. Doesn't matter what type your partner is. The point is that can you go to health? You see? In times of liminal space, when you're not in control, can you go to health? That is what makes good relationships. Now, I want you to envision, this is kind of what it looks like. You see, it's going all the way down. So the floating selves of all 9 types move down into one great anchored self. That anchored self we could call as the face of Christ. What Christian Enneagram teachers will talk about is that Christ has 9 faces. The virtues, the anchored self versions of all the types. That's the Christ, the inner Christ. It's you, it's me. We are members of one body. You see? Okay. All right. So we've got the unhealthy compulsion vice. So we're just flipping the floating self terminology and putting the unhealthy compulsive, the vice. Because it was originally taught as originally taught as sins, but that's not so helpful because we get into the purity models and morality and things like that. The reason why it was called sins is that when it was first developed in the 300s, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, we can talk about it at another point. But it was because sins were seen as blindnesses, not things you do, as things we can't see about ourselves, which is why we do what we do. Because if we could see it, we wouldn't do it. So now we call it vice. And then we have the anchored self, which is healthy, freedom, virtue. Okay? Sort of different kinds of energy. Can you feel the energy there between the floating self and the anchored self in this model? All right. So we're going to start with the ones. May I have a show of hands, all of you perfectionists out there? Does anybody know? Okay, good. All right. Now, if you, excuse me, if you don't know, you're, excuse me. See, I got to be perfect when I talk about the ones. Because you're going to judge the heck out of me, because I know you judge people. But I feel sorry for you because you judge yourself worse than anybody else. If you don't know your Enneagram type, raise your hand if you don't. You're all 6s. No, I'm just kidding. If you don't know your Enneagram type, that's okay. And if you think you do, hold on to it loosely unless you're real sure. Because you're going to be the type that you don't really want to be. Unless you're an 8 and you're like, hell yeah. But you're going to be the type that it's like, oh God, I hope nobody really knows this. Am I really like this? Oh man. Typically, that's how we identify ourselves. But also start looking at the gifts. So I am going to be talking about the gifts, but it's primarily going to be looking at the shadow, the vice, because that's how we can see what we don't see, the unconscious part. But remember, we all have all types. So the one is the part of you that holds high values and sees what is ideal. It's also the part of you that is haunted by resentment. Okay, so the Enneagram type 1, one title is reformer, another title is perfectionist. At their floating self level, they're angry, resentful, rigid, and uncompromising. And what I mean by those things is that they once all have, and all of us actually, have had what's called an inner child wound. It's like the archetype of being thrust out of the Garden of Eden. When we were little kids and everything made sense, then all of a sudden we get thrust out in some way. And we try to spend the rest of our life living up to the ideal of what we think reality should be. So ones walk around at all times, 24 hours, unless they're real healthy, with some level of what reality should be. In fact, they should all over themselves and all over you. Ones have a sense of the perfect, the ideal, and the coulds and woulds and shoulds. And when reality does not live up to those ever-present ideals, they can feel resentful. But they learned early on, somehow in their childhood, that it wasn't safe or good to express anger. And they want to be good little girls and good little boys. The one senses goodness, their perfection in terms of morality. And they want to be good, and anger is not good, they learned. So what they do is they suppress it. And if you suppress it, if you repress it, it's going to come out. And it will come out in clever ways that doesn't look like wrath or anger, but it comes out as judgment, judgmentalism. Serious all the time. Not able to relax sometimes. It's like they have a sense of the perfection of how things should be, and when it's not, they are quick to get resentful and get angry, but then they immediately feel bad because that's not being good. So they try to go bad, and they put guilt on. They're suffering from guilt all the time. I mean, you just start feeling sorry for them after a while. But if they're average to unhealthy, they project that shame and guilt on top of you, and they shame you. And they guilt you. And, a lot of people are natural leaders, so a lot of them rise up in the ranks. And a lot of pastors, there have been, I know that I've seen some studies, but, that's really easy for me to say, well, there is research, out there without giving it. But I know that I have seen somewhere that a lot of pastors are ones and 8s and 3s. But a lot of them are ones. Why? Because there's a righteousness, a goodness, a morality piece. There's a sense of I've got to, not only do I know what's right, but I got to sort of like, in the name of Jesus, bend everybody towards my will, or bend an institution or a regulate or whatever it is into my will in an uncompromising way. And when people fall outside of that, as a shepherd that I see myself, the appropriate approach, if I'm average to unhealthy, is to aggressively rein them in by shaming and guilting and rigidity. Okay, that's what you see a lot. at the top. But you got to know that ones are always judging themselves constantly until they can't handle it anymore. And average to unhealthy ones split. What do I mean by split? That's the preacher who gets up and preaches. I'm just gonna make this. This is common in the Catholic Church, and since I'm Catholic, I will absolutely be able to throw myself under the bus. So you'll have, like, say, the priest who's a one, and you can always tell an unhealthy one because they're just, I have an agenda. You're about to hear my agenda. And they get up there very righteous, and they're doing this, and they always chop, they're doing this, and they're trying to chop reality. They're trying to reform reality. They're chopping at it up. And they'll say, gay people, and they'll just pick on gay people and homosexuality and this and that, and they just, rrr. And then you find out what? They're gay and they've had a split life. Okay? Common. And it's common in a lot of places like that. So usually when you have someone who's righteous about something, and angry and just real sure, start thinking maybe that they've actually got something on the side that they're actually doing what they're angry about. Because that's probably true. Or it's likely. Or there's a potential for it. Just think about that. So the healthy one is serene, conscientious, and principled. There is a serenity, and what a healthy one looks like is that they don't need to reform reality. You see, Martin Luther was a one. What did Martin Luther do? He tried to reform the Catholic Church. Now, the Catholic Church, as an institution, like all institutions, are sixes. So they just, they didn't want any change, so they just excommunicated him. So they became, Martin Luther tried to, but his idea was to try to reform. Ones are reformers. But at their healthy level, only when they've realized that they're full of crap, just like everybody else. And when they can fall in love with the color gray, not black and white. See, ones are really black and white. All of the instinct types are black and white. Instant black and whiteness, and they were only going to, usually from the average to unhealthy, are only going to be able to see reality in dualistic qualities. Good, bad, either or, black and white, boom. That's how you know you're dealing with an instinct of the gut instinct, the 1, 8, or 9. But when ones can realize that they're full of crap, just like everybody else. No, to be honest, when they can realize and embrace their own imperfection, when they can realize that they're wounded like Christ, that perfection is not the absence of imperfection, that perfection is the incorporation of imperfection. When ones can do that about themselves, that's when they fall into grace. That's when they allow God to really love them. They can be a pastor for 30 years and they haven't had a relationship yet with God. They're still trying to earn God's love. And they may even be able to talk eloquently about spirituality, but inside they're tormented because they know just how crappy they really, how imperfect they really are. And they haven't forgiven themselves, so they can't forgive you for not living up to their potential. But you're around a healthy one when you're in the presence of someone who looks at you. There is a sense of solidity. Healthy ones are solid, just like 8s and 9s, just the most solid of all of us. But there is no judgment. You know what there is? There's curiosity. Healthy ones are curious, but they're not judgmental. They're curious because what flavor of reality are you? Because I've learned to actually let go expectations because they're always wrong. So no, I'm just curious, what in the heck are you doing here? I don't know why I said that with the thickest Texas accent I could. What are y'all doing here? I don't know. So they're conscientious, they are principled, they're value people, they have a set of morals, good, it's great. But it's no longer either or. What is it? Both and. It's, yes, I can do this, and no, I can't do that. Or, yes, I see what you're saying, I really understand, that's good. And I wonder how this aspect of your life is helping you be happy. Instead of, what the H are you doing? You see? There's a way in which a healthy one is a great pastor, but an unhealthy one is rigid, uncompromising, angry, even if they can give off the image, the floating self of, serenity, but inside there's not, because if they're at leadership levels, the whole structure will be rigid, and they'll try to conform people into that. But if they're open, then it's fresh air, and then open air is coming in, and then diversity is honored. You see? And Richard Rohr taught me this. Unity is not uniformity. You see, unhealthy ones want all things to be the same. My way of perfection. Unity is not uniformity. Unity is diversity maintained and protected by love. I'll say it again. Unity is not uniformity. Unity, true unity, is diversity maintained. So I'm gonna set up in the structure to maintain different points of view. Maintained and protected by love. That's true unity. And healthy ones know this. The way to get into the anchored self for a one is learn to relax. Realize people change at different paces. Become a servant leader and ask them what they need. I'm not going to tell you what you should do. I'm not going to tell you what I need from you. If I'm a healthy one, I'm going to say, from the spirit of servant leadership, which we learned from Jesus, what do you need from me? And what is your vision in this particular position, or something like that? You know what I mean? And then let me help you achieve that. Ask yourself, does self-criticism help you feel of peace and belonging? We all have the critical voice. Maybe you don't, I don't know. We all have the critical voice. But one's, that's a shout. That one's on steroids. That one's got the megaphone. And what you don't realize is you have a choice to turn that volume down. But when we're identified with the critical voice that's yelling, you're not good enough, you're not smart enough, you have imposter syndrome, you don't belong here, you almost feel like a weird sort of joy, like a morose joy of letting, beating yourself up. So I ask all of you, especially if you're ones, when was the last time the self-criticism helped you feel peace and belonging? It's just an open-ended question. Get in touch with your feelings, you ones, allow anger to really be felt. And then when you are angry at others, realize that you are angry at yourself first. When you are angry at others, when you feel a need to lash out at others, realize that you are angry at yourself first. Welcome back. So I do appreciate you allowing me to talk about the anchored self, floating self for almost the entire first half. But I hope you can see how important it is. Because if we don't get the energy of the anchored self at least understood intuitively, if we don't get that down, then the Enneagram doesn't make much sense. And it doesn't become a tool of transformation. And that's what it was for. That's what it is now. As a tool of transformation, again, to bring that water level from the conscience, just that conscious level, bring it down so we can see some of the unconscious stuff that's going on, the stuff that we do not see, and then we're able to address it. And so I'm going to ask a question. What does holiness mean again from this perspective? Wholeness, that's right. So now you can see a little bit better that the more we are embodying our anchored self, for the one, it's into serenity, conscientiousness, principled, but from a place of freedom to allow them to, me to make my mistakes and to be imperfect, then I can allow that for you. And those are the people that, they deal with wrath, they deal with resentment almost all the time, but you become the exact opposite. Your virtue is the exact opposite energy than your vice. Why? Because you're constantly working on the vice. The resentment for the one is always there. And so when you learn to accept it and surrender into the reality of life being gray and learning to forgive it for itself, the resentment gets transmuted. Remember, we are here to transform negativity to positivity. So it gets transformed into serenity. But it's not a false serenity. It's a serenity that is hard won. And when you're around a really good one. You're around a one who's done their work. Okay, let's move on. We have the 2, my hometown, my people. I can always spot my peeps. The 2 is the part of you that loves. It's also the part of you that is needy and manipulative. Okay, so 2s in general are very loving people. We're sweet. Oh, she's just so sweet. He's just so kind. Yeah, we want you to think that. Because we want to believe it ourselves. The Christianity on the superficial level can actually be a little bit harmful in a sense for 2s. Because it's like serve others and, a good Christian will martyr themselves for the other people. And 2s at the superficial level, the average to unhealthy, we make an art form of that. But there's a price we pay for it, and usually you have a price too because we lash out. Resentment builds, because you're not loving me the way I know how to love you. And when you don't love me the way I love you, then we attack. But we're going to talk a little bit about that. So, the Enneagram type 2 is the helper, healer, and giver. The helper, the healer, and giver. And we learned early on from 0 to 4 that our worth is really dependent largely on how well we can help other people. So this is the person who's helping mom with the other kids, or helping mom because she's had a rough day, or in school, 2s are the ones that are helping the teachers, or some people come to us because we have a kindness about us and they want to talk to us, and we love that. Because the more that we can talk about your problems, I can look good and feel really good about myself, and I don't have to say a dang thing about mine, which is how we run away, actually. Isn't that interesting? 2s run away from intimacy by often engaging in relationships. But we do it from the average to unhealthy is, I want to know everything about you. I want to help you because indirectly, I'm helping myself by helping you because I know what you need and I don't know what I need. But I know that if I help you, I'm somehow feeling whole and worthy, and doggone it, I want you to like me. So if you like me and you love me and I help you, then I belong somewhere. And that's what twos really want. So you can think of a two as somebody who is indeed very loving, but there's actually a pretty decent-sized emptiness, right, smack dab in the middle. So, how does that manifest? Well, pride. Pride is the vice for the two. And what it means, it's not a pride of like, look how, look what I did. I'm proud of myself in that sense. It's not that. It is more subtle than that. It's a blindness. And my gosh, it's so true. I know the Enneagram, and I fall into this all the time. So, please have a little respect for yourself, or gentleness with yourself. Because if you really learn the Enneagram, you'll never really not move past your floating self. Remember, killing the ego death, I'm beyond this is not the point. It's going through the wounds. But first you have to know you're wounded in order for you to go through them. So the two has a wound right smack dab in the middle, and it is, I don't belong anywhere. But I got to earn it. I got to love you somehow, because that way you'll love me. And the pride is that I'm going to ensconce myself into your life so that your life would be crap without me. That's the pride. Your life, your organization, this thing that we have right here, without me, forget about it. See, twos don't necessarily like to be the king or queen. It's too much energy. But we like to be the advisor to the king, and we want to be whom the king and queen come to when they're hurting or need advice, because that's the real power. Because if I can get the king and queen to love me or like me, then I must really belong. Now, what twos have to do, it's actually kind of easy to do counseling with twos. Not only because I can totally speak their language because I'm a two, but it's because I know the games we play. And I know that a lot of giving that twos do. So if you're a two, hold your tears till afterwards. No, you're welcome to cry now. Use your mask. The two, we don't give conditionally, folks. We think we do, and we really want to be seen to be giving unconditionally. But we don't give unconditionally. We give conditionally, and we don't know it. And that's where the pride comes in. And that's why we manipulate, and we don't know it. Because what happens oftentimes, one way that this can manifest is, remember, I think I told you guys earlier on that twos, the heart people can read minds. Nobody does it better than twos. I mean, it's a gift. It's like some people are in my office. It's like, how do you know exactly what I need or how I'm feeling? I didn't even know how to put that in words, but it's exactly like nuanced what I'm feeling. That's a gift. But in partnerships, when you have a two who's upset at their partner, The way it sometimes works from the average to unhealthy levels is that the two will say, if you really loved me, then you would just know what I want or what I need. Because the truth is that they know what you need, oftentimes before you even need it. And in fact, a lot of twos will actually impose upon you to help you even when you didn't ask for it. You ever been around somebody who feels a little smothery? Smother, almost like this kind of like, let me help you, or help me help you. Help me help you. So you can kind of tell like a two is average to unhealthy when they're almost like walking around like, what do I do at parties? You know, even when it's a party and they're supposed to relax, they have to put themselves in the place of the servant. So they go to the host or hostess and let me help you. And the energy is given off is, oh my God, okay, this person, okay, think of a job to give this person so they're feeling calm, to assuage their anxiety. Help me help you. And we become manipulative and we expect other people to read our minds the way we can read other people's. When I have a two client, I say that is not correct. And the other partner's like, oh, thank God. Because nobody else can have the gift of reading minds like twos can. So if you're any of the other types, I say to the two, you have to learn how to identify your needs. It is nobody else's responsibility but yours. And if you don't know your feelings, that's what we're going to work on. What are you feeling? What do you need right now? Well, I need my husband to ... No. You can't control somebody else's behavior. What do you need? Usually it's going to be a combination of I need space to actually discover myself. I need time alone. I need time where I don't have to help. So when a two learns to identify their needs and then learns to be assertive, because what happens is when twos are not being given what they are giving, they become hyper aggressive in their words. And it blows up and they can just like tears and anger and yelling and you don't respect me, you don't love me, look at all I've done for you, I did this and this, and they just start throwing these accusations because they've been keeping score even though they thought they've been giving unconditionally. You see? So what twos have to learn is, what do you really need? And can you explain that in an assertive, compassionate way? And it's always going to be some form of setting boundaries. Twos need to learn how to say, yes, I'll do that, but no, I won't do that. Or, no, I can't do that. And when twos fall into their anchored self, they are humble. And it's a kind of humility that is, it's where they're, let me put it to you this way. Mother Teresa, I don't know if you've heard that person, Mother Teresa of Calcutta, I'm sure you have. She one time said that she saw herself as the pen with which God wrote a love letter to humanity. You see? And that's poetic. She was an 8, so not bad for an 8. But the thing is that humility at the level of the 2 is where you become almost like a crystallized instrument, where it really is no longer I, but Christ who lives within me. And then a 2 can give unconditionally. There's no strings attached, because at that moment of anchored self-living, it is an embodiment of the divine in you giving to God in the other person. And there's not much you there. It is what 2s really want to be. But it's not coming from a place of emptiness in the middle. It's coming from a plenum, an overflowingness of love. that they feel. Okay? Freedom. They have the freedom to not help. I remember the first time when I actually came upon this, where there was this, I was going to counseling, and in the waiting room, there was a lady who was coming in. I guess she was an hour early or something, and she was crying. And the two counselor and me, ironically, here I am going to counseling, the two counselor and me wanted to like, are you okay? You know, like I wanted to somehow assuage her tears. But what was it really inside me? You know, I wanted to feel, okay, you know, the vulnerability I felt by sitting in the waiting room of going to counseling is some way this helping her with whom I had no relationship would allow me to feel some level of power, because there's power in giving in a sense. And I remember specifically in the Enneagram, because I'd been learning about the Enneagram there, I was like, I'm going to intentionally decide not to offer help. I prayed for her, but it wasn't where I felt, the compulsion was to reach out and do it, and I actually reined myself in and sat in my own embodied integrity and just like radiated out love. I was radiating it, but it wasn't something I had to act out. There's a freedom in not giving from a place of emptiness. Okay? So the two really wants freedom. In their anchored self, they're able to do that. And they do have unconditional loving. So, the path to the anchored self, this dying that we talked about on the cross, you know, the crucifixion, what is required to get into the resurrection or the anchored self of the two is, it is not selfish to meet your own needs. Selfish is the scary word for two. I don't want to be selfish. It's not selfish to meet your own needs. What are your motives in helping someone? Ask that question. Every single time until you get used to this, if you were two, ask the question. Now, if someone's dying on the side of the road, don't ask the question. But ask the question, get in the habit of, where is this coming from? Where is my need to help coming from? Just get used to it. Asking the question. You can still go ahead and help, but hopefully that question will give you enough space, sort of psychic space, to detach from the need to help and switch right into the want to help. Do you feel the difference between I need to help versus I want to help? Ask people what they need. Ask them what they need. Don't assume you know, even though you're probably right. But very few people like to be given stuff and helped when they haven't asked for it. But you know why? Because it's disempowering. Respect the free will and the ability for another person to reach out. And you can always ask what they need. And they may say nothing, even though it's really serious like they do. But we don't know where they're at in their life. And maybe this is an important time for them to prove something to themselves. So ask what they need. And lastly, let it be. Do not remind people all you do for them. Once you do something, if it's truly unconditional, let it be. You see? Spend time alone. This is important for all the types, but this is the most important for twos. Spend some time alone. And I'm going to be honest, if you're married, your partner's real used to you doing everything, so you need to have a conversation. I went to this Enneagram training. It totally changed my life. And by the way, your life's about to change too. You need to have a conversation where the best way for you to be more present to the family is to have some boundary time alone where your husband or wife or your partner or your family member, whomever, holds as sacred your time away from them. I'm holding it as sacred, your time away from me. I will do what is necessary that your need, you can go and do whatever, what you need to do. because I know you're going to come back and you're going to come back refreshed. And if your partner's not willing to do that, it might be where you need to set some boundaries. And that's important too. It's very hard for twos to set boundaries, but it's really necessary. Lastly, learn to recognize affection and good wishes of others towards you. One of the hardest things it is for twos is to actually receive compliments or receive gifts from other people who are giving unconditionally, mostly because we think we're indebted. If you're given to me, then oh my God, it's like a burden. You're giving to me, God, now I got to give to you, or I don't know how to take this. Because maybe you're doing it like I do just to get me to like you. No, receive it. The greatest thing a two can do after identifying your own needs is to actually receive when people give to you. Why? Because it is a great act of vulnerability to receive. To truly receive is a great act of vulnerability. And that's what twos do not want to do, to be vulnerable in the way of neediness. So that's your pathway to the anchored self. You become the most humble servant of all because you are the most prideful. But you do become the pen with which to write a love letter to humanity by God. Okay? The three is the part of you. Oh, okay. Got it. The three is the part of you that is your vocation to the world, in the world. Your vocation is present when you are and what you do are aligned. It's also the part of you that deceives yourself and others to look good. Okay, so the part of you that what you do and who you are is aligned. That's 3 energy. And it is also the part that deceives. So we have the Enneagram 3 is the achiever, ambitious, and the doer. Not human beings. 3s are human doings. The floating self is deceit, untrustworthy, and narcissistic. What I mean by deceit is not necessarily like telling straight out lies, but it's an exaggeration of the truth so that they look better, so that their image that they're trying to project will be more accepting of how they want to be perceived, this successful. And so their worthiness actually is merited by their competence in the outer world, to what degree that they achieve. They say that 50% of CEOs are 3s. I don't know if that's true, but it seems so. They're usually good looking. You kind of buy them. They're natural salespeople. They know how to work a crowd. And they begin to believe the masks that they put up. But when they can flip into their brokenness, when they can flip into seeing that they actually are not the masks that they put up, and usually it's because they have to fail kind of big to realize this is enough to break open, their floating self and to actually see for the first time who they really are. When that happens, then they have a sense of honesty, and they're more honest than anybody else. Why? Because they're constantly trying to BS themselves and everybody else to make their image to be a certain way of success, confidence, efficiency, that kind of thing. But they have to break down, and they become very honest that they can't do it all, nor do they have to, and that they're loved regardless of what they do. See, 3s think that they're going to be loved if they do it all. And there's an inner integrity that happens. They will be efficient. Oh yeah, they'll never not have energy. 3s are high energy people, and they run circles around the rest of us. But one of the things that I help 3s do when I see them in counseling is I say, get busy learning how to surrender. That's a paradox. Use your willfulness in surrendering your ability to change the outer environment. Get busy learning how to surrender. They like the get busy part. And threes are adaptable. They really are. Like, problem solve with a 3, you're going to come out with a solution within 20 minutes. And because with the way they understand stuff is like, if there's a wall in between me and the goal, like 8s, they're just going to go and bust it down and, remove the wall. 3s are just going to go, just around, continue. Like, they're going to be very efficient, and they're going to figure out how to streamline stuff. But you got to watch it. If you have a 3 in your life, then the best thing you can do for that 3 is to tell them, I love you, not for what you do, but just for who you are. And you don't have to do anything for my love. Realize that real success means being honest. Real success means being honest, not the lies or the deceit. Go out of your way to connect with someone you care about. A lot of 3s forget to just tell people you love them or text them. They're so busy. Take breaks. You're exhausted and you don't know it. 3s have got to take some breaks. And that's why they'll go to retreats, and sometimes they're amazed that they can sleep like 5 hours a day, in naps, and then at night, because they've just been wired. Ask, who is that person behind the mask I project, or that is projected upon me? You see, 3s are successful, and a lot of us will project success on top of them. So that's something they have to kind of drop too. Learn the power of saying yes and. Like, yes, I'll do that, and I'll not be able to do that other thing. Learn about the 2 halves of life, or you will just repeat the first half over again. Hint, the rules change in the second half of life. So just to give a really quick idea on this, the first half of life is about building an identity. It's about building success. You need that. But at the second half of life, you can still be successful, but it will teach you nothing. It's just a repeat of the values of the first half of life. And America is a first half of life culture, and it is a 3 culture. So that's why you can have 80-year-old men, let's say, or women, I guess, too, that are successful, but they're kind of like boys still, They haven't learned yet to take the mask off and to realize that the second half of life is about letting your identity go or giving it away. You shore it up in the first half of life. You build success. You got to have that. But the second half of life is about letting it go, giving it away, empowering the rest. And 3s do that better than anybody else when they're in their anchored self. 4s, the 4 is the part of you that sees beauty in all things. It's also the part of you that is green with envy. Are there any 4s in here? You're 4? Who else? You know what? I think you might be the only one, which is very good for you because you want to be unique. Because as you can see, 4s are the individualist, bohemian culture, aristocrat, the artist, the romantic. Romantic in the sense of kind of like the romantic period of Beethoven. Think of Beethoven, Compare Beethoven to Mozart. Mozart wrote a million songs, and they were a lot of notes and jumpy. I mean, good stuff too, don't get me wrong. But Beethoven was very deep and wrote much less. Beethoven was a 4. Shakespeare was a 4. Who else can go to the depth of the human condition and write it with such nuance? A lot of your singer-songwriters are 4s. So with 4s, it is envy is their vice. And it's not envy in so much of like straight jealousy of Okay, so they do constantly compare themselves, but they're comparing themselves to the uniqueness of other people. They want to be, in a sense, unique. They see themselves as unique and elite. They hate that about themselves because they hate those kinds of people. And they're those kinds of people. And when they see somebody else who's equally talented or equally something, then they're going to be thinking, God, I wish I was that. And they're also really, really happy they're not like the rest of us, the sheeple out there. But they secretly are envious of people who make life easy. You see, fours are deep, complicated and complex people. They have an incredible inner life. But they look at the rest of the people who they wouldn't want to be because we're all sort of superficial butterflies just going from flower to flower, never really, sucking on the marrow of life like they are all the time. But they're also secretly envious because, God, I wish my life were a little bit easier. I wish I could just be normal, just pay the bills and die. That would be nice, not to have all the weight of the world, of the beauty of the whole world on top of me, and I've got to somehow channel that so all of you can see. It's a lot of burden that fours put on themselves. They really, they can be self-absorbed. They can be constantly thinking about who am I in this situation? I need to be able to go deep. They hate small talk. And I don't know if that's your experience, but it's like, just skip all of that, get to the deep stuff. And if you don't have the deep stuff, I'm out. Now, they can also be depressive personalities. They hate the fact that they're depressive, but they wouldn't have it any other way either. Because when you're depressive, great art, Van Gogh, their art sometimes, when they're average and healthy, their art depends upon their depressive state. Because that's how they feel like they can finally break into the beauty of the world. But once they get into their healthy self, they actually become what's called equanimous or equanimity, which means an even-souledness. In other words, they're in touch with depth, but they bring the depth to everyday life. So when you have a really healthy four, there is such a solidity with them. There's nothing that will shock them because they are actually secretly attracted to the dark side of all things. They're comfortable with the dark, the shadow. But they bring a depth to a gravity, a beautiful a gravity of a space, a spaciousness of acceptance to everybody when they're really all systems are firing. They're self-renewing at the healthy level. When they're unhealthy, they're constantly looking for this spiritual thing will fill me. No, this spiritual thing. No, this guru is going to finally fill my existential void. This teaching, I'll have to enhance this chakra. Whatever it is, they're constantly on the lookout for something that will speak to their soul level, and then they'll go for that because that is absolutely true. And then then what happens is that when it doesn't work, they become completely depressive and they don't know where to go. So they can become almost suicidal a lot of times. You'll get that. But when they're doing well, they're self-renewing. They don't need any other outer source. It's all internal, and it's a self-renewing process inside them because they're always in touch with beauty, and for them it's an effortless way to then give you an ability to see beauty too. You see, that's why there's so many artists as fours, because they're making beautiful art for the fact of this is what they're intuiting all the time. The depth of all reality is in my art, and if I give you this, I'm giving you an experience of beauty too. Fours their beauty is to create experiences. That's what they want to give. That's their art. And they may have a million different ways to do that. And so healthy fours can do that, and they can engage in the outer world. They can both be deep and pay their bills. You see? And the last thing that fours do is they learn how to experience logic. Normally they don't, so we're going to touch on that now. Realize your feelings are not your true source of support for you. Fours have to learn how to, I feel this. Average to unhealthy fours will mistake their feelings for objective truth. They don't realize that it's subjective truth. How I feel today, an average to unhealthy four says, this is exactly how truth is. But then tomorrow, when I feel differently, this is exactly how truth is. And the rest of us are confused. What fours do is you can actually learn to look at your feeling as helpful, but it's not your final source of making decisions. Bring in logic. Avoid putting off things until you are in the right mood. I know fours who put off stuff for years when it could have been done in one day because it's not the right time yet. The stars haven't aligned in some ways. Know that you will never be together enough to engage in the world, so just do it now. You're never going to be all put together. Develop a wholesome self-discipline. Avoid lengthy conversations in your imagination. Practice self-compassion. So I recommend you can type this down, write this down, selfcompassion.org. It's like self-compassion.org. That's a great place for everybody, especially fours. But it's Dr. Kristen Neff is a psychologist, and she's done research on self-compassion, and she has great ways to help us achieve that equanimity. And look for the beauty that is always and everywhere present. There's beauty everywhere. So just go ahead and look for that, to be embodied into yourself, and you will see beauty everywhere. Okay? And fours love black, by the way. You're just dressing the part, They don't love attention. They want to be individual, but they don't love attention. I'm so sorry. Do an art form about, Yeah. Fives. Fives are the part of you that is wise and discerning, and it's also the part of you that is aloof and out of touch. Have you ever known anybody who is really heady and they just talk, and they have no social cue IQ? They don't know social cues, so they're asking questions, and all the rest of us are ready to move on, and they're just having a personal conversation in the middle of a classroom with a teacher, and even the teacher's like, dude. Those are fives at some level. And the five is the investigator, the quiet specialist, the observer. They observe. They usually sit in the back of the room like Aaron. Just kidding. They sit in the back of the room because there's too much energy up front. So they sit in the back so that way they can view not only what's going on up here, but view everybody else's reactions. Not because they're trying to figure out how to fit in, but because it's all so interesting. The word interesting is incredible. That's the word for fives. Oh, that's interesting. That's interesting. Well, that is just so interesting. They don't like to commit either way, so it's all interesting. They don't like to engage at the average unhealthy levels. It's all head stuff. It's greed is their vice. It's not greed in terms of material wealth. Usually fives live a rather minimalist life. One book in a library and one chair, that kind of thing. But it's greed in terms of details and knowledge. They will ask you oftentimes lots of questions, because if they ask you questions, it's not so much that they're curious. It's more of, the more I know about you, the more power I have. Now, they would never admit that, but that's kind of what's going on. And they're usually very quiet. They're greedy. They don't self-give. They don't give a lot of their internal life because they don't want you to have power over them. So they will be quiet about them. But once they have gained your trust, they have diarrhea of the mouth. So have you ever known anybody like that? It's like you talk to them and it's just one or two short answers and it's like, yeah. It's like, dude, this is really difficult. I'm going to be having to work here for this conversation. But then once they've gained your trust, it's like, it's time to go to bed, dude. It's gone. And it's good because they have a captive audience and they want to share finally someone that accepts me and my thoughts, which they have a lot of incredible, brilliant thoughts. So, but they can become aloof if they're not careful at the floating self level. They're not going to be engaging with their life. They're not going to be taking the knowledge they have and doing something with it. So they can become stingy that way, and they can become a little bit schizoid. Schizoid personality is kind of like where you have a hermit sort of lifestyle, and you don't want relationships until you realize you're lonely, and then it's like, what do? I have no practice. Now, the healthy level, moving into the anchored self level, engages and is non-attached. You see, 5s can be incredible judges because they're not attached one way to or another if they're healthy, but they also engage. It's a really great paradox held together. It works at the really anchored self level of a 5, is that they engage with life. They can they make great teachers at the healthy level. They're incredibly fascinating. They have all these details, but they're not engaged are not attached in the sense of an agenda to make you think like me. They really will respect the free will of someone else to make up your mind, but I'm going to lay it all out here, and I'm going to trust that you're going to make a decision. 5s at the healthy level do that. There's a warmth. Oftentimes, 5s are not warm. Now, they inside feel warmth. But if you ask somebody else, they'll say, God, Joe, he doesn't, do you think he even was engaged, listening at all? Or what do you think of him? He seems kind of dry. And if you tell a 5, they're going to be completely shocked because inside them, they're feeling all these feelings, but they don't know how to let their body language express this. And so no one else knows this. But at the healthy level, they will say things, I love you. They will actually, touch someone. They'll be okay with giving hugs. They'll engage with their body. So if you're a 5, I do invite you to reach out and touch someone, figuratively, or be engaged with people so that they know how you actually feel about them, because they won't know otherwise. Take the risk, that vulnerability. And 5s at the healthy level are open-minded and holistic seeing. At the unhealthy level, 5s are dogmatic, and it has to be exactly like this theology, exactly. But the healthy level, they're open-minded, and they have their outline in their mind that has lots of blank spaces. And that doesn't scare them because they're okay with not knowing. See, 5s, the image is I know at the unhealthy levels, but the deeper levels is I also don't know, and I'm okay with both. Realize you often replace direct experience with concepts. A lot of books, maybe not a lot of experience. It's okay to not know, get used to the unknowing nature of mystery, which I think Catholics do a pretty good job with that. I mean, I was kind of hitting hard on Catholics, but Catholics and other people like the liturgical denominations are better with mystery oftentimes. You don't have to know. And it actually, there's a way in which the unknowing is its own knowing, because you make space for the wholeness of God, which is mystery. And by the way, the word mystery means you'll never know. It does not mean you can never know something. That's what a lot of us think what mystery means. I'll just never know. The actual definition of mystery, and this is one that fives can actually hold on to, is there are so many ways to know that you'll never do them all. Just when you have approached a phenomena in one way, then you learn there's another way, and then another way. You see? And so that's why it's a mystery, because it's incomprehensibly comprehensible. Put that together and smoke it. Just kidding. Okay. Notice when your thinking and speculating takes you out of immediate experience. Better to have immediate experience for the anchored self 5. Get hands-on with something. So if you're a 5, is everything that you do about your head? If it is, go garden. Learn how to give massages. Do something with your hands. Trusting people can bring deep fulfillment. A lot of 5s don't trust living people. They are better friends with books. Learn to recognize others' body language. It's often not natural for 5s, the body language piece. So I invite 5s to study. You can make it a scientific study. That'll appeal to you. And start looking at body language. Develop awareness about social cues. And let people know you care for them. Use words. Not every, that's like I said before. Be warm. Okay, the 6, moving right along here. The 6 is the part of you that is loyal. It is also the part of you that has general anxiety disorder. We all have anxiety, okay? But 6s make an art form. That is because they are constantly prognosticating the prognosis of what's going to go wrong in the future. They're never in the present moment. Their head is always in the future, what's going to go wrong, and they're fretting around about what's going to go wrong, and what do I do, and what do we do, and oh my gosh. They have constant anxiety and fear, and they don't know it because it's the air they breathe. So I'm just going to tell you right now, 6s is the most popular number out there, by the way. They're the salt of the earth. They're wonderful, humble people. And if you have a 6 in your life, and when they start talking about their fears, when I have a 6 in counseling, I'll say, so let's walk down this logical fear that you have all the way down to the end and see what the worst thing it could possibly be is. Because they constantly think everything's a monster screaming, this is going to be the future and there's no way to avoid this future. Hello? You can't see this? So you walk down with them all the way logically, you walk down that path and you get there and what they thought was a monster is a kitty cat. It's never as big as they thought. And they can survive just about anything. So that's how you deal with 6s, is that you walk with them compassionately down to the end extremity of their logical minds. Okay, and then realize that their anxiety is not going to, their fear will be okay. Will be okay. The 6s is the loyalist, the devil's advocate, the skeptic, and the clarity seeker. Okay, because 6s are anxious, they want to get it right. They want to make sure they know, and they're never quite sure of themselves or their own power, so they'll always ask questions. So anybody who asks a question from now on, you're a 6. Just kidding. But they're always asking questions not because they need to know the answer to the depth. They just want clarity. They already have an idea, but they want clarity. Am I really thinking the right thing here? Am I this? What happens if it's that? They want clarity because in their head, they're trying to walk down all of the possibilities. And what I do with sixes, it sounds so cliche for a therapist, but they'll ask me what I think what they should do. And well, if you could wave a magic wand, which I happen to have in my office, like I bought one, I pull it out, and I say, what would you do? And they always have the right answer. They just needed some affirmation to get empowered. And they always know the right thing. Sixes are very loyal. They're loyal, and you have a good partner if you have a six. At their floating self, they do have fear, they have high anxiety, they can become paranoid. Paranoia, six stuff. They say Hitler was a six. Nazi Germany was a six energy. Germany is a six country. So there's a sense that they were fearing the power that they had scapegoated on the Jewish people for all of their problems. Sixes can be very professional scapegoaters, and then they go attack those people or that object in the name of patriotism or pride, national pride. So, nothing wrong with national pride, nothing wrong with patriotism done well, but it is a six energy, and when it goes badly, it is six negative energy that you see. And so what sixes are doing to try to assuage their anxiety is they're attracted to authority in a person or in an institution or in ideas. They're naturally conservative, even if they're politically progressive, or they belong to a progressive institution. They're progressive. They're conservative inside that progressive. Like, for example, Unitarianism. The Unitarians are pretty progressive, but you'll get sixes who say that's not how we do it here. You see, you know what I mean? Now, at their anchored self level, there's courage. They're the most courageous of all. Have you ever seen the movie Romero? Anybody ever seen the movie Romero? I do actually invite, I know it's a Catholic thing, but I do invite you to go watch that movie. You can rent it. It's called Romero, and it's an archbishop of El Salvador who is a six. And he was very dutiful and loyal to Rome, but then when he actually engaged with the poor people of El Salvador, he defended them. He was the most courageous of all, and they killed him for it. They did. And he didn't care, because he's speaking from his own truth. What sixes do constantly is project their power onto other people, especially authorities. And if you're an authority and you're pastoral, you will give it back in an affirmative, compassionate way and say, I don't care what you decide, but I will walk with you. They need solidarity, like we all do, but they will become the most courageous. They're interdependent at that level. They're not codependent. There is I decide to be vulnerable to you. A healthy six is, I'm giving my independence to you because I'm deciding it, not that I need you to tell me what to do. And they're grounded and reliable at their healthy level. If you are present, then your anxiety can be energizing to get things done. So if you're a six and you do feel anxiety, that's okay. Just use it to get things done. Anxiety can be a good motivator. Learn to trust yourself and external authority at the same time. So, for example, experience, scripture, and tradition. Imagine that as a tricycle. But experience is the big wheel in the front, and tradition and scripture are in the back. Learn to trust experience, to trust your inner life, dialogue with the external authorities, and that is a healthy way to be a six. It's a healthy way to be a person, but for a six especially, trust your experience, trust yourself. Others very likely think better of you than you realize. Your fears tell you more about your attitudes towards others. So if you get 6s who are constantly paranoid about other people, if you get 6s who are constantly thinking that other people don't like them, let me put it to you that way. If you get 6s who are constantly thinking that other people don't like them, that is because deep down inside at the floating self level, they don't like, or they're paranoid of other people. So if you can help a 6, people actually like you a lot more than you think. And the fact that you think nobody really likes you, that's actually deep down inside is your inability to accept other people as they are. Okay? No, that's just true for all of us. When you're anxious or stressed, keeping your opinions to yourself helps your relationships. 6s will feel a need, because of their worry, will feel a need to just share all of their opinions. You know, when we decided to have 3 kids, my mom, who was a 6, God bless her, holy woman, that one, she didn't say, well, congratulations. Her first thought, I kid you not, was, oh, what are you going to do when you go to a restaurant and there's only a table for 4? God, Mom. I needed to have some space, and then I re-engaged with her with some love there and kind of talked her through about how that could have gone differently. But I would say healthy too. Keeping your opinions to yourself can help the relationship sometimes. Hold on to that anxiety in that liminal space, baby. Watch your tendency to project and displace. Project is what I don't like about myself, I project on top of you. Displace is I can't do anything about my boss that's doing this, so I come home and I take it out on you. Projection and displacement are the 2 things I see in counseling. That's 90% of the people's problems. Projection and displacement, twins. Okay, number 7. The 7 is the part of you that is joyful, and it's also the part of you that is never satisfied. 7s are joyful. They really are. If you look at their eyes, they're smiling. Even their smiling eyes. And they're almost always like looking up. Because, honestly, that's where they want to look. They don't want to see anything down there in the shadow. So it is a smiling eyes, whistling in the dark spirit. Not gonna look at those bones in the closet, so let's go out and party. 6s are joyful. They're the life of the party. They're usually extroverted. They do not know how to help you other than, and this is how 7s, almost always average to unhealthy 7s will respond this way. Look, you look like you've had a really rough time. I know exactly what you need. Let me take you out and let's just get trashed and have so much fun, you know? Or let me give you an experience to distract you. Like that's what really 7s, let me give you the experience of distracting yourself from your pain, which sometimes you need. But they make an art form of it. And so 7s actually don't like to commit because committing entails planting roots. Planting roots entails weathering problems. Skeletons come out of the partner or myself or that job, and I don't like that. So the way 7s talk about is I'm feeling smothered. But really, oftentimes what it is I don't like being trapped because they don't want to go deep. So 7s they're enthusiasts, they're adventurers, they're visionaries, they're thinking a big picture time, picture somebody at the top of a mountain, endless horizons, endless opportunities. God, that feels good for a 7. That is where they want to be all the time. And so if they have to narrow it down in one track and go forward, that's when they feel entrapped. Okay? The floating self is gluttony. It's not gluttony in terms of food, it's gluttony in terms of experience. They want to experience it all. and they feel like they're missing out. So if they hear about someone else having fun, they're going to feel a sense of, I've missed out on that. They can be shallow. Sevens can be actually pretty shallow because they're not willing to face anything below the surface, the average to unhealthy levels. And there's a sense of restlessness, a never enoughness, high energy and restlessness. You get that with sevens. They can almost seem bipolar. Doesn't mean they are bipolar, but they can be manic in terms of like high energy and doing something, and then they can fall into sort of despair because, that didn't live up to what I thought was going to be. Even when they're on the beach of the most amazing vacation that they've planned for 5 years and saved up, they're not enjoying the beach. They're on the beach thinking about next year's vacation. You see? So the 5s, 6s, and 7s, the head people, are always thinking about the future. At the anchored self level, there's a thing called the sober joy. It's not necessarily sober from like no drinking or something like that. It's sober in terms of it's joy after the cross. You see, average to unhealthy 7s, it's kind of a shallow, superficial joy before the crucifixion of their powerlessness. And then when they've gone through their darkness and shadows and learned to survive it, and then they can be joyful, but this time it's after the cross. They've gone through that. They're still joyful, but it's a grounded joy. It's a sober joy. And there's an optimism. They are optimistic, but they're no longer too optimistic. Now it's a realism that you can trust. And they balance out the one who's sort of dour or the 6 with their anxieties, you see. And they're playful. They're like children. They get along with kids. And it's beautiful when they're in their anchored self. Because adults have to learn how to play. We don't know how to play. So channel your inner 7. Find that little person inside and play. Find some play and do it. Recognize your impulsiveness. Let most of your impulses pass. 7s feel like if they don't indulge in their impulsive feelings, oh, I've got to do that, or I've got to do that, they're going to be missing out on life. And what they have to learn is to let those things pass. Realize you do not have to have everything this very moment. Preference quality over quantity. Become friends with your shadow. In other words, 7s will often, notice that, they'll go to a party and they're going to be attracted to the person they see is in the corner and that they're assuming is not having a good time. And they're going to try to go over and help them, bring them in, which is nice. But you know what they're really doing at an inner level? That's an external gesture they're doing for their internal inability to go down and into their own shadow. So they're seeing it externally as someone else, and they want to incorporate. You see the longing there to go deep? But they don't go down inside themselves. And so a healthy 7 will. And a healthy 7 becomes friends with their shadow, and they become friends with the shadows of others. Your baggage no longer scares me. But before the cross in my life, your baggage scares the heck out of me, and heck no, I do not want to be in this relationship, and you're smothering me. And so if a 7's with a 2, the 2's like, you've lost that loving feeling, and the 7's like, ah, and gets the heck out. So like this dance of constant retreat and pursuit. But at the healthy level, a 7 plants roots, goes down, is solid, is joyful, and knows how to meet the shadow of the other person because it's not scary anymore. They're not whistling in the dark. They're embracing the dark in silence. Okay, the 8. The 8 is the part of you that actively expresses being. It's also the part of you that is all or nothing. Okay? The 8 is, I want you to picture an 8 as the perpetual, at the average to unhealthy, the toddler in grown up bodies. Constantly in touch with being the way toddlers are. It's just touch here and touch there, and it's full body and stumbling into things and experiencing things, and it's chocolate, it's on my first birthday and I'm just putting chocolate all over my body. That's how 8s live their life at the average to unhealthy. And they act out, and they can become toddler-esque, almost childlike in their yelling and having to be right. No, it's my way. So the 8 is called the challenger, the active controller, or the boss. 8s are leaders. They really are. They really do have a gravity about them. When they walk into the room, the whole room notices something just shifted. But they often do not know how to relax and be vulnerable, because they learned early on, for some reason, that it is not safe, in a way, to be weak. Now, it's part nature, part nurture, like I said. So they've learned that it is important to put on an external shell, and they are thick-skinned because of that. They don't get hurt all that hard, where the rest of us are going to be melting, especially 2s, would be melting in terms of like, God, that's painful. Like, you could have a conversation with an 8 and just scream and yell, and there's going to be some cuss words and stuff. And for the 8, it's like, finally, we're actually having a conversation. Whereas everybody else is sort of, oh, dude, like that was painful to go through. And then the 8 says, we were just talking. I don't know what you're taking offense for. Something along those lines. So the average to unhealthy 8, the vice is lust. But it's not lust in terms of sexual lust. It's lust in terms of too muchness. It's never just 100%, it's 120%. It's complete all in or nothing. There is no middle ground with an average unhealthy 8. It is 100%, I will be there to the very end, and until I decide you're not in it with me, and I'm completely out, and I may even go on a vengeance attack on you. Now, 8s at the average unhealthy level are not easy to get along with. They're bullies, they're dictators of families, they're dictators of countries. They will remove the existing power and supplant themselves, because they are the king-queen archetype. And they will suffer no challengers if the average is unhealthy. They don't even know how to say I'm sorry at all. Because if they say I'm sorry, that means that they're showing weakness, and that means everything I have ever done that I should say I'm sorry to, I was wrong, and I am not wrong. 8s do not see themselves as being wrong at the average to unhealthy. And so they can have a cruel authoritarianism, all or nothing. It's win, win, win. And even their language is, well, we're bringing the big guns in there today. Even their language is warlike. You see? But what ends up happening is, because at the very end of their life, 8s, because of being a tyrant, nobody can really stand them. They become self-alienated. And they're lonely and they're miserable, but they'll die with their middle finger in the air. F the world, F all of you, I'm out. Because at least there's some inner integrity in their stubbornness. But the average to healthy levels, you're not going to get any better leader than an average to healthy 8. Because they're the ones that have the energy and gumption, and quite frankly, the ego to plow through things when they need it done. They will see themselves as shepherds, and they will protect their sheep. They will. And they'll create kingdoms not for their own benefit at the average to healthy, but for the benefit of the people that they're serving. They become the quintessential servant leader. Martin Luther King, 8, healthy. Mother Teresa, 8. You see, she was 4'3" or something like that, and she would go to bishops, or she would go to people, big owners of buildings, and say, I need this building and you're going to give it to me. And they would. Of course, she would say, if you don't, God is going to get you, but which is an 8 thing to do as well. But anyways, at the healthy level, there's an innocence about them, like enjoying life for the first time every day, the wonder of life. And the 8s, you can have a tattooed biker gang guy, scary maybe on the streets, who is in love with little children. Just gets on their hands and knees and just can totally, that baby is dominating the 8, and the 8 allows that. Why? Because inside every tough 8 is a beautiful, innocent little child. And they only allow 2-3 people in their life to enter into that. And that's all they need. The rest, they're going to be external and boundaried and tough. And that's okay, because they need that. We need the world to have healthy 8s. As long as they allow people in, at least 2 or 3. Because they can be truthful, they can be servant leaders, and they can be forbearing. Are you familiar with that term, forbearing? An 8 who forbears is an 8 who holds all of you because they are the king or queen archetype. They represent the kingdom. So energetically, when you walk into their presence, they are able to hold all of you, embrace all of you, love all of you, and there's nothing you could do to shake their love for you, because they're geared into your anchored self. So if you have an 8 in your life that's healthy, you are completely protected. You know nothing is going to get to you, because this 8 is larger than life. That's what a healthy 8 who forbears can do. Your real power, this is how you get into the anchored self if you're an 8. Your real power is inspiring and uplifting others. 8s do not need compliments. It doesn't mean it. They don't trust it. The best thing you can do for an 8 is to actually succeed in what the 8 is trying to tell you or teach you, and 8 will feel completely fulfilled when their mentees do well. Learning to really listen to others will actually empower you in the long run. 8s do not like to listen to other people. Well, they don't think you have anything worth sharing. I mean, why should I listen to you when I already know the answers? But if you can actually learn to listen to another person's side, that will change your life and gives you more power. So I'm speaking to your desire for power. Listening to others will actually increase your power. Not to manipulate them, but to serve them. And it makes you more fulfilled. Many people look up to you, so be mindful of what kind of leadership you are displaying with your energy and behavior. People are looking at 8s. That's the energy you have. What are you doing with it? Remember that people won't remember what you said as much as how you made them feel. 8s need to remember that. How am I making that person feel if I have to challenge them? And then lastly, learning how to be vulnerable is your price to pay for the life you want to create for yourself and others. So in other words, and I'm going to say this in 8 language, you're going to have to carry a big burden. And 8s are like, yeah, bring on the burden. And the burden is for you to be vulnerable. It's so hard for 8s more than anybody else, because you got to admit you're not that strong and you're not that powerful. But here's the weird thing. If you're from a Christian perspective, it's the power of powerlessness. It's the power of the crucifixion leads to resurrection. It's the power of vulnerability leads to transformation. And so the one thing that you're most afraid of is actually the one thing that will set you free. And I have seen 8s do a 180 real quick because they want to take it on, and then they move from dictator to a Martin Luther King kind of figure, and it's incredible. Okay? The last number, and I saved the last because if you're a 9, I'm not going to be talking a lot because you know what? There's not a lot to talk about with 9s. Just kidding. 9s are the part of you that resides in the stillness of being. They're very quiet in a sense. Their energy is quiet. It's also the part of you that disappears. So the unhealthy 9 wants to be invisible. You see, 8s chop up reality. They just blow it up, bulldoze it. 9s cut it into small segments so I can deal with it. And I'm sorry, 1s cut it into small segments. So 8s blow it, 1s chop, and 9s are like in their tortoise shell, disappearing. So that's kind of how the energy you can see of the instinctual type. Their title is adaptive peacemaker and mediator. 9s are some of the best mediators out there because they really do see both sides. And they see it from a place of not needing to win. You know when you are around a 9, a healthy 9, well, really any type of 9, there is no sizing up game. There's not a lot of ego there to have to defend or get offended from. 9s don't have a lot of ego. You know what their lifestyle is? Why stand when you can sit? And why sit when you can lay down? And just translate that into the rest of their life. Because their vice is sloth. My wife is a 9, so we have the Enneagram humor. God, you're slothy today. Yeah, well, you're a needy too. What do you need? No, I do call her royal 9ness, though. Because 9s desire comfort at all costs, as at least my wife does, comfort at all costs. At the average to unhealthy, they can be passive aggressive. So whereas 8s are aggressive, the FU, 9s are, I'm just not going to engage. But you know what both the aggressive and passive aggressive have in common? It's about control. Because I beat you if I don't engage with you. You see? We can't have a dialogue or a conversation if I'm not participating. You don't get what you want. So sometimes you have 9s like, oh, I forgot. Was I supposed to do that? At the average to unhealthy. They can be extremely stubborn, but they won't give you a reason why. They just know that the average to unhealthy is they say it's the most stubborn type. Because there's really nothing you can grab a hold of. Can you grab a hold of air? You can't really engage with amorphous shapes. So average to unhealthy 8s are very stubborn in a sense, and they numb out. So when reality is too much, they will get busy doing nothing, like playing Sudoku for hours or games. Or pot. Pot is the choice numbing device for 9s. Let's just sit here and do nothing. Ooh, sounds like a good idea to me. They can have a catatonic sense to them where they'll just be still. My wife, lovely 9, very healthy actually. But she will be in one position for like 5 hours with her little comfy robe and her comfy little blanket and her comfy little slippers right on the couch. And this is her way to relax. Whereas that would drive me nuts. But 9s, this is totally cool. Disengage. And they need to do that from time to time. But unhealthy 9s do it all the time. The healthy 9s into the anchored self, they have mindful action. So to give you an idea, they make lists and do them better than anybody else at the average to healthy levels. And they don't do it with an anxiety. They don't do it with a hurriedness like the rest of us. It's like, well, this is just what you got to do. So let's just do it. And they can be the leader of something. And when you're the employee of a 9, you're not going to be lorded over. There's not a sense of he or she's the boss and I'm under her and there's power that it's this. The 9 naturally sees themselves as equal with everybody, and we have different roles. That's the average to healthy 9. Okay? So they're incredible leaders, and they're not doing it from a place of winning. They're doing it from a place of mediation. Let's all input and let's go with something together as a group. 9s can do that with no ego to win. They're great at the anchored self level. They're greatly content. They don't need much. They're kind of minimalist. Like I said, a blanket, a sofa, and slippers, and they're good. The other thing about 9s, especially if you're any other type, if you're a 2 or a 7, I'm talking to you right now. If you have a 9 in your life and you go to a party, 2s, 7s, and 3s are going to be personally offended if your 9 is not as engaged in the party as you are. And you're going to think, no, if they're going to take it as a personal offense, and people are going to think that this 9 is an elitist, that this is not good enough. And that is not true. What 9s need is not much. It's too much energy oftentimes. They like to be off on the side. And so the best way you can be a partner at a party if you're with a 9 who probably doesn't want to be there, 95% sure doesn't want to be there, is to simply go in and check on him from time to time. Hey, do you need anything? Are you having fun? I'm so glad you're here. That's all a 9 needs. So it's the equivalent of pat on the back, doing great, thanks for being here, and then walk off. But a 9 just wants to be included, but doesn't want to engage all the time. And you have to respect that about 9s, even at the healthy levels. And lastly, the healthy level of a 9 is they can transform negativity into positivity. I know you're a 9 because you told me. What's your name again? Dave. Do you ever feel like when you're around a tense situation, I don't know if this is your case, but a lot of 9s will talk to me about walking out of it and sort of feeling bodily tightness, like in there, especially like right here, and then they have like a headache, and it's like their stomach is all tense. It's because if there's a tense situation, drop a healthy 9, the whole room calms down. The volume comes. Why? Because they're human energy sponges. But the price you pay for that, now you do that good job for everybody else, but the price you pay is that you take that energy into your body, and if you don't know how to release it, it'll turn into chronic fatigue, chronic pain, or addiction. That's the big one. Addiction is a big one. So we don't know what we do with this anxiety that lives in our body, so we numb out. But if you're a healthy 9, you know how to, take all of that and do what you need to do to get rid of it. But you do humanity a big service by just your body. You don't have to do much, and you don't want to do much, so that's good for you. Examine if you go along with others. Just keep the peace and be nice. So a lot of 9s will just I'm just going to go along and just keep the peace. I'm not going to really do anything, Examine if you're doing that. Because if you are, people want to hear from you. Engage. Become an active participant in the world around you. Healthy 9s engage the world around them. They have a sense of self. Unhealthy 9s do not have a sense of self. Recognize that you have aggressions, anxieties, and feelings you need to deal with. A lot of nines don't know what they feel, so they hold it in their body and they do addictions or they have pain. So they have to realize you have feelings, you have things that make you upset. Learn how to speak about them. Exercise or moving your body can help you become more aware of how the emotions live in your body, because they do for all of us. So just to kind of end on this note, next time you have an anxiety, like right now when everybody's thinking I need to get out, next time you have an anxiety, find out ask that emotion, where do you live right now? Where do anger or anxiety live in my body right now? Because I guarantee you it's living in your body. Find out, and then focus that specific area in your body and breathe into it. What I mean by that is pretend that your lungs are located right there in that spot. Breathe slowly in through your nose into that, even if it's your left earlobe. Breathe into that, and what happens is the mind-body connection begins to bring blood there, but also awareness. And whatever is in there, that anxiety sometimes just needs to be witnessed, and it can help, okay? So do that. Nines especially, but all of us. Breathe into that place of tightness. So I want to thank you so much for allowing me to come in and share this way, the anchored self, true self, and the Enneagram. And if you are interested in any kind of coaching or counseling, you're welcome. I have cards in the back, or I'm going to be hanging out for a little bit here, so I'm happy to connect with you. Thank you so much for coming. God bless you.
Thank you, Doug. We really appreciate it. That was very meaningful and helpful. And like Doug said, you're welcome to stay and ask questions. Those of you that do have children in childcare, please go and get your children first because they are ready to go. Let me close this in prayer, and then I have a few announcements. Lord, we thank you for this opportunity to come together, to learn more about each other and ourselves, and to open ourselves up and how we can be the healthiest person that we can. In Christ's name, amen.